900 years ago, a woman locked inside a stone cell wrote something that scholars are still trying to fully understand today. She was not a queen. She held no political power. She had no army, no fortune, no formal university education. By every measure her era used to evaluate human significance, she was invisible. And yet the words she left behind, carefully preserved in monastery libraries and Vatican archives across 9 centuries, describe the relationship between humanity, nature, and civilization with sophistication that continues to astonish researchers, theologians, philosophers, and ecologists alike. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen, and her work is one of the most extraordinary and underexplored bodies of knowledge in the entire history of Western civilization. What makes her story so compelling is not just what she wrote. It is the conditions under which she wrote it. It is the era she wrote it in. And it is a remarkable fact that her ideas, developed in near total isolation in the 12th century, have found an unexpected resonance with some of the most pressing questions of our own time. If you are drawn to the kind of content that takes history seriously, that goes beyond the surface of what we were taught in school and looks at the deeper currents running underneath, then this channel is built for you. Subscribe now and join a community of people who believe that the most important ideas are often the oldest ones, and that the voices history almost forgot sometimes have the most urgent things to say. Because the voice of Hildegard of Bingen has waited 900 years to be properly heard, and what she has to say is remarkable. Hildegard was born in 1098 in the lush green valley of the Nahe River in what is now Germany. She was the 10th child of a noble family. According to the ecclesiastical custom of the period, a family's 10th child was considered a tithe, an offering dedicated to God. And so, at the age of 8, Hildegard was brought to the monastery of Disibodenberg, where she entered a process of enclosure that medieval society treated with the solemnity of a funeral rite. The bishop read the office of the dead. The door was sealed. The young girl who entered that enclosure would not walk freely in the outside world for decades. She was dedicated to a life of prayer, contemplation, and silence. She was, in the language of her era, buried alive for God. But even within those stone walls, something extraordinary was already happening. From earliest childhood, Hildegard experienced what she consistently described as what she called the living light. And the precision and consistency with which she described this experience across her entire life is one of the things that historians find most remarkable about her. She was insistent on several points. This was not a dream. It was not a fever. It was not experience in darkness or in a state of altered consciousness. She saw the living light while fully awake, eyes open, in the middle of ordinary daylight hours. She described it as a luminosity that illuminated what she called the deep structure of things, not the surface of the world, but the invisible architecture beneath it, the patterns, the connections, the relationships between elements that ordinary perception cannot access. And through this light, according to her own careful account, she perceived things that the formal learning of her era had not yet mapped. She described the Earth as a sphere suspended in the cosmic void at a time when spherical cosmology was understood by scholars, but certainly not universally accepted in popular understanding. She wrote about the relationship between the nervous system and human behavior with a precision that anticipates concepts that medical science would not formally articulate for centuries. She described the universe not as a mechanism or a stage, but as a single living, interconnected organism in which every part responds to every other part. For 30 years, she kept these perceptions almost entirely to herself. And the reason she gives for that silence is one of the most revealing things she ever wrote. She was afraid, not of being considered unusual. She was afraid of being considered heretical. In the 12th century, a woman who claimed direct spiritual perception of divine realities was navigating extraordinarily dangerous theological territory. The line between mystical insight and heresy was thin, and the consequences of crossing it were severe. So she held the living light inside herself. She continued her prayers, her studies, her enclosure, and historians believe that the prolonged suppression of what she perceived as a genuine vocation began to manifest in the physical symptoms she documented throughout this period. Episodes of blindness, episodes of paralysis, sustained periods of severe physical weakness that she would later interpret not as illness in the conventional sense, but as what she described as a refusal, the consequence of withholding something that was demanding to be expressed. In 1141, according to her own account, she finally surrendered. She describes hearing, from within what she called a voice of fire, a direct instruction to write and speak what she perceived. She took up a stylus and a wax tablet. She began to write, and she records that as she began to write, the physical symptoms that had plagued her for years began to lift. The result of that first act of creative surrender was her initial major theological work, a text she called Civias, which translates as Know the Ways. It is a work of astonishing scope and complexity, combining theological commentary, cosmological vision, musical composition, and moral philosophy into a single unified document. When the manuscript began to circulate, it reached the attention of Pope Eugenius III. The Church's response was not celebration. It was investigation. A formal commission was dispatched to the Rhine Valley to examine this woman and her writings. They tested her theology against established doctrine. They interviewed her at length. They looked carefully for signs of psychological instability, for delusional thinking, for evidence of any influence that the Church would have considered spiritually dangerous. Their conclusion was unambiguous. What they found was a mind of exceptional clarity and theological precision that exceeded the standard of most formally trained male scholars of the period. Pope Eugenius himself read her work aloud to his cardinals at the Synod of Trier. He then did something that had virtually no precedent in the ecclesiastical culture of his era. He granted a woman explicit authority to preach and formally declared her visionary writings to be authentic spiritual communications. He placed the full weight of papal endorsement behind the work of a woman who had been enclosed in a monastery since childhood. For contemporary researchers approaching Hildegard's work, this historical context is essential. Her writings do not exist at the margins of medieval intellectual culture. They were examined, tested, and validated by the central institution of that culture. She is not a marginal figure. She is, by the official designation the Church would later formalize, a doctor of the Universal Church. Her ideas carry the full weight of that credential, and once the door of public expression opened for her, she walked through it with remarkable energy. She began to travel. She preached in public spaces at a time when that was virtually unheard of for a woman. She composed an entire body of sacred music, the Ordo Virtutum, which remains one of the earliest surviving examples of morality play in Western history, and is still performed by ensembles and choral groups today. She wrote extensive works on natural medicine, on the properties of plants and minerals and their relationships to human health, works that historians of medieval medicine study as significant contributions to the scientific thinking of her era. She maintained an active correspondence with emperors, kings, abbots, and popes, writing letters of striking directness to most powerful men of her time and not hesitating to offer criticism when she believed it was warranted. She told the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa that his governance fell short of what his office demanded. She corresponded with Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential theologians of the 12th century, as an intellectual equal. She was, in every sense available to a woman of her era, a force. But it is her cosmological and philosophical work that has attracted the most renewed scholarly attention in recent decades. And at the center of that work is a concept so original and so coherent that contemporary environmental philosophers and ecologists have begun to take it seriously in ways that go well beyond historical curiosity. She called it viriditas. The word in Latin means greenness, freshness, vitality, the living quality of things that are growing and flourishing. But in Hildegard's theological framework, viriditas is far more than a botanical observation. It is a philosophical and spiritual principle of the first order. According to her writings, viriditas is the energy of the divine expressing itself through the created world. It is the force that keeps living systems moist, fertile, generative, and interconnected. It is, in her understanding, the spiritual equivalent of what we might today call ecological vitality. the quality that distinguishes a living, balanced ecosystem from a degraded or depleted one. And Hildegard taught that viriditas is not a fixed quantity. It is dynamic. It responds. It flows more fully or more weakly depending on the relationship between humanity and the rest of the created order. When human communities live in what she described as balance, in right relationship with the natural world and with each other, viriditas flows freely through the entire system. The natural order functions as it was designed to function. The seasons follow their proper rhythms. The waters are clean and generative. The soil is fertile. But in her writings, she developed a philosophical argument that was genuinely radical for the 12th century. She argued that human moral and spiritual behavior has direct consequences for the physical condition of the natural world. When humanity becomes what she describes as dried out spiritually, when communities fall into patterns of exploitation, disconnection, and spiritual emptiness, the consequences are not limited to human society. They extend into the physical environment itself. In the language of a medieval theologian, she was articulating something that contemporary environmental ethics would recognize as a version of the idea that human civilization and the natural world exists within a single interconnected system, and that damage to one part of that system propagates through the whole. She wrote, according to translations of her Latin manuscripts, that the earth is sustained by the powers working through it, but that when human communities abandon the principles of balance and care, the elements themselves become unstable. She describes the air becoming heavy, the waters losing their purity, the seasons losing their predictability. Historians and literary scholars are careful to contextualize this as what it is, the philosophical and theological observation of a 12th century mystic working within a conceptual framework available to her era. It is not a scientific statement in the modern sense. It is a work of visionary theology. But what makes it remarkable is the coherence and sophistication of the underlying intuition that the health of the human community and the health of the natural world are inseparable, a principle that modern ecology has arrived at through entirely different methodologies. This concept of viriditas is a foundation upon which Hildegard built her most ambitious symbolic framework, a visionary chronology of human history expressed through the image of 5 beasts. In her later writings, she describes a vision in which she looks toward the horizon and sees a rope hanging in the sky. Tied to that rope are 5 creatures, 5 distinct animals, each one representing a different era of human civilization, each one characterized by a different relationship between humanity, power, and the natural order. Scholars of medieval literature have spent generations interpreting this sequence, and while precise correspondences are always a matter of scholarly debate, the broad interpretive framework has a remarkable internal consistency. The first creature in Hildegard's symbolic chronology is a fiery dog. In the interpretation of historians who have studied her work, this creature represents the early medieval period, an era organized around principles of strict hierarchy, absolute loyalty, and rigid command. It is the age of feudal structure, of the great chain of being applied to social organization with rigorous literalism. The fiery dog is disciplined and vigilant. It maintains order, but it maintains order through force and fear rather than through genuine justice or warmth. It is an era, in Hildegard's symbolic language, of strength without tenderness. The second creature is the yellow lion. This figure, according to literary analysts of her work, symbolizes the era of martial glory and national ambition, the high medieval period when great kingdoms rose to the peak of their power and civilization became obsessed with conquest, legacy, and expansion of borders. The lion is a creature of genuine magnificence. But in Hildegard's symbolic vocabulary, the lion's pride is also its vulnerability. The very qualities that make it glorious, its confidence, its dominance, its sense of its own centrality, are the qualities that make its eventual fall inevitable. She was writing, scholars note, in an era when she had personally witnessed the pride of emperors and its consequences. The third creature is the pale horse. Medieval literary scholars interpret this figure as representing an era of speed and acceleration, a civilization beginning to move faster than its own wisdom can sustain. The horse is powerful and capable. But the color matters enormously in Hildegard's symbolic system. Pale suggests a draining of vitality, a loss of the viriditas that sustains living systems, even in the midst of tremendous outward momentum and achievement. Historians who draw on this framework often associate the pale horse with a period of rapid intellectual and material transformation that reshaped Western civilization beginning in the early modern era, a period of extraordinary achievement that also inaugurated new forms of disconnection from a natural order. The fourth creature is the black pig, and it is here that Hildegard's symbolic chronology becomes most recognizable to contemporary readers. In her description of this era, she does not focus primarily on warfare or political conquest. She focuses on consumption, on indulgence, on a civilization that has organized itself around the principle of having more, always more, as its central value and highest aspiration. She describes a cloud of heaviness hanging over this era, not a physical darkness, but a spiritual and psychological weight, a restlessness and dissatisfaction that material abundance cannot address, because the hunger driving it is not material in nature. The symbolic resonance of the pig in Hildegard's framework is precise. It is a creature that looks downward, that roots in the earth for what it can consume, that does not lift its gaze toward transcendence or meaning. According to scholars of her work, this symbolizes an era in which civilization has progressively detached itself from the vertical dimension of existence, from questions of meaning, purpose, and spiritual vitality, in favor of an exclusive focus on horizontal accumulation. The viriditas is being consumed rather than cultivated. Literary historians who study this framework often note its resonance with the material culture of the 20th century, with the emergence of consumer society, the culture of mass production and mass consumption, and a progressive prioritization of material wealth as the primary measure of collective and individual success. They are careful to frame this as symbolic and interpretive resonance rather than literal prediction, but the resonance itself is striking. And then comes the fifth and final creature, the gray wolf. According to Hildegard's symbolic framework, the era of the gray wolf follows the era of the black pig as exhaustion follows excess. It is characterized in her description by a pervasive moral and epistemological ambiguity. The defining quality of the wolf era, in her symbolic vocabulary, is the color gray itself. Gray is neither black nor white. It is a color of twilight and fog, of the liminal space between one state of being and another. In the wolf era, according to her writings, clarity becomes rare. The old structures and certainties that organize previous eras begin to lose their coherence. The relationship between people and their institutions, between communities and shared sources of meaning, becomes strained and fragmented. She describes this era as a time of what she calls cunning, a word she uses to suggest a replacement of wisdom with manipulation, of genuine authority with performance of authority. The wolf, in her symbolic system, is a creature that does not build. It scavenges. It takes what others have created. It exploits weakness. And she suggests that the era of the gray wolf is one in which these qualities come to characterize not just individuals, but entire systems of power. Hildegard's literary description of the gray wolf era is, according to scholars who have studied her work carefully, one of the most psychologically sophisticated passages in her entire corpus. She identifies what she considers to be the most dangerous consequence of living within sustained confusion and ambiguity. She argues that when communities are exhausted by prolonged uncertainty, when they have lost access to reliable sources of meaning and direction, they become vulnerable to a particular kind of deception. They become desperate for clarity, for a voice that seems to cut through the fog, for a figure that offers the certainty and direction that the gray age has stripped away. And it is in this context that she introduces a figure she calls, using the traditional theological term from the letters of St. Paul, the son of perdition. It is important to understand how Hildegard uses this term in order to appreciate both its literary sophistication and its historical context. She is not writing a political pamphlet. She is not identifying specific individuals or institutions. She is working within an established theological literary tradition and using its symbolic vocabulary to develop a moral and philosophical argument about the relationship between spiritual emptiness, social vulnerability, and the nature of genuine versus counterfeit leadership. In her description, the son of perdition does not arrive as an obvious threat. This is the core of her literary argument. He arrives as a healer, as a restorer, as a figure who appears to have the solutions that the exhausted wolf era is desperately seeking. He speaks, in her description, with eloquence and apparent sincerity. He addresses the genuine grievances of people who have suffered through confusion and deprivation of the wolf age. He appears to restore order, to heal divisions, to repair what the wolf era has broken. But Hildegard identifies what she considers a fundamental characteristic of this figure, the quality that separates apparent restoration from genuine healing. She says that while he can imitate the appearance of Viriditas, he cannot generate it. His solutions produce order, but not life. They create structure, but not vitality. They organize, but do not renew. Everything he touches has the form of health, but not its substance. She frames this in her characteristic theological language. He can imitate the light, but he cannot generate the warmth. And it is the warmth, the genuine relational and spiritual vitality she calls Viriditas, that is the actual measure of the health of any civilization. This literary and philosophical analysis, according to scholars of medieval theology, represents one of the most sophisticated discussions of the relationship between authentic and counterfeit authority in the entire medieval corpus. Hildegard is not simply warning about a future event. She is developing a philosophical framework for distinguishing genuine flourishing from its simulation, a framework with obvious relevance to any era in which the appearance of leadership can be constructed and performed independently of its substance. In her later writings, particularly in the Liber Divinorum Operum, Hildegard expands her visionary geography beyond the Rhine Valley and describes, in terms that literary historians find genuinely puzzling, a great nation beyond the ocean. She uses language that does not correspond to any territory known to 12th century European geography, a land of many tribes and languages, of immense wealth and power, destabilized not by military conquest, but by the forces of the natural world itself. Scholars debate the interpretation of this passage extensively. Some read it as a purely symbolic vision with no specific geographical reference. Others note that its description of a powerful Western nation facing destabilization from natural forces has accumulated new interpretive weight in light of developments the 12th century could not have anticipated. All serious scholars are careful to contextualize her language within its theological and literary framework, rather than treating it as literal geographical prediction. What Hildegard describes in connection with this passage is a sequence she calls the Great Purification. In her cosmological framework, the universe is a living system, what she visualizes in one of her most famous images as a cosmic egg, with layers of air, ether, fire, and earth all function together as a single integrated organism. When the balance of that system is sufficiently disturbed, the system responds, not as punishment in her theological framework, but as consequence, as the living systems attempt to restore the equilibrium that sustains all life within it. She describes fire from the sky, great waves, the darkening of light, the disruption of the patterns that ordinary life depends on, and she frames all of this in language that her literary interpreters consider among the most striking in her entire corpus, not as the end of the story, but as its necessary turning point. The purification in her framework is what breaks the hold of the counterfeit. It is what strips away the artificial and reveals the essential. It is what creates the conditions under which genuine renewal, genuine Viriditas, can return. According to her vision, the son of perdition is ultimately undone not by superior force or superior argument, but by the simple inability of artificial systems to survive contact with the reality of the living world. In her beautiful and precise phrase, he is brought down by the breath of God, by the ordinary functioning of the created order reasserting its own laws against anything that has tried to replace or override them. And what follows, in Hildegard's visionary chronology, is the passage in her work that scholars of medieval literature often describe as its most personally compelling. She calls it, in various formulations across her writings, the Age of Peace. And the description she gives of it is of such quiet, luminous simplicity that it stands in striking contrast to everything that precedes it. She writes that in this era, the seasons will return to their proper rhythms. The waters will be clean. The soil will be generous. She describes people who have, through the experience of everything that preceded this age, lost their appetite for the kinds of pursuit that characterize the eras of the pig and the wolf. She describes communities that have rediscovered the value of what is simple, what is natural, what is real. Communities that come back into right relationship with the living world, and in doing so, have found viriditas returning, flowing again through the system that had been depleted and degraded for so long. This is the trajectory of Hildegard's great visionary project. Not the triumph of darkness, but the restoration of light. Not the permanent defeat of life, but its ultimate resilience. But we are not there yet, according to the scholars who study this framework. And so the question that Hildegard's work ultimately poses is a practical and personal one. How do we live well within the gray fog of our own time? How do we maintain our vitality, our clarity, our genuine humanity, in an era characterized by the ambiguity and exhaustion and moral confusion that her wolf symbolism describes? Hildegard, the physician, did not leave this question unanswered. In the thousands of pages she produced across her long and extraordinarily productive life, she developed what we might today call philosophy of personal resilience, a set of practices and orientations that she believed could sustain genuine human flourishing, even within the most difficult historical conditions. She organized this philosophy around three core principles. The first is what she called the rhythm of life. Hildegard was one of the great composers of the medieval era. Her sacred music, the Ordo Virtutum, the Symphonie, the sequences and antiphons she wrote for liturgical use, represent a body of work that musicologists still study with admiration for its harmonic sophistication and emotional depth. Her engagement with music was not incidental to her broader philosophy. It was central to it. She believed that the universe itself has a fundamental musical structure, a deep rhythm that underlies all existence. And she taught that when human beings align their lives with that rhythm, when we organize our days and seasons in harmony with the patterns of the natural world, we become more fully alive. We become more capable of the clarity and discernment that complex times demand. Conversely, when we live in chronic disorder, when we deplete ourselves through unsustainable patterns of work and consumption and stimulation, we lose our capacity to perceive clearly. We become vulnerable to confusion and manipulation that characterized the wolf age. Her prescription was, in the language of her era, theological. But its practical content resonates with what contemporary research in biology and psychology describes as the importance of circadian alignment, of seasonal attunement, of the relationship between physical health and cognitive clarity. The second principle she called a reasonable measure, and it is perhaps her most countercultural teaching in any era. In a theological culture that often valorized extreme asceticism, Hildegard argued consistently for moderation. She warned against excessive fasting as emphatically as she warned against gluttony. She warned against spiritual fanaticism as insistently as she warned against spiritual indifference. In all things, she wrote, "Let there be measure, let there be proportion, let there be the balance that sustains living systems rather than the extremism that depletes them." Her argument was that extremism in any direction is a symptom of viriditas being compromised. Healthy systems, whether biological, ecological, or social, tend toward dynamic balance rather than rigid extremes. And a person who has cultivated the reasonable measure, who has developed the internal calibration to recognize sufficiency, is far less susceptible to the appeals of figures who offer extreme solutions to the genuine difficulties of difficult times. The third principle is the one she returned to most consistently across her entire body of work, and it is the one she expressed through the image that has become the most enduring symbol of everything she believed: the feather. When scholars and correspondents press Hildegard to explain how a woman of her circumstances, enclosed, physically frail, without formal academic training, could have produced a body of work of such scope and depth, she consistently refused to claim special personal power or extraordinary intelligence. Instead, She offered an image that is simultaneously humble and cosmologically audacious. She said, "I am a feather on the breath of God." The physics of this image deserve careful attention. A feather in flight is not propelled by its own force. It generates no thrust. It expends no energy fighting the wind. It is light. It is hollow. And because it offers no resistance to the current carrying it, because it has emptied itself of the heaviness that would cause it to fall, it can be carried anywhere the wind moves, over the storm, above the mountains, across distances that a heavier object could never traverse. In the context of her broader philosophy, this image is a precise description of the spiritual orientation she considered most essential for navigating the hardest passages of human history. The gray wolf era, in her framework, is defined by heaviness, the heavy fog of confusion, the heavy weight of accumulated greed, the heavy anxiety of people who have lost access to genuine meaning. And the response she prescribes is not to add more weight in opposition. It is to become light, to empty the self of the particular heaviness that makes genuine perception impossible, to cultivate the kind of interior spaciousness that allows the deep currents of reality to be perceived and responded to rather than resisted and denied. She writes that those who have cultivated this quality will be carried safely through the turbulence that the wolf age and what follows it will generate, not because they are protected from difficulty, but because they have developed the flexibility and responsiveness that allow them to move with the forces at work rather than being crushed by them. This is the final paradox of Hildegard's great visionary project, and it is the one that has kept her work alive across 9 centuries of human history. To survive the hardest times, you must become the softest thing. The most resilient thing is not the most rigid. It is the most supple, the most responsive, the most genuinely alive. As we look at her work from the distance of nearly 1,000 years, what strikes contemporary scholars most forcefully is not any specific predictive accuracy, though the symbolic resonances of her historical framework are genuinely striking. What strikes them most is the coherence and sophistication of the underlying philosophy. A 12th century woman, working within the theological and intellectual framework available to her era, developed a comprehensive account of the relationship between human moral and spiritual life, the health of natural systems, the dynamics of power and vulnerability, and the conditions necessary for genuine flourishing. She developed a concept, viriditas, that anticipates in important ways the ecological thinking of the 20th and 21st centuries. She developed a symbolic history of Western civilization that, in the interpretation of serious scholars, has remarkable explanatory power. She developed a philosophy of personal resilience that modern psychology and philosophy continue to rediscover through entirely different methodologies. And she did all of this while enclosed in a stone cell, in an era that had no framework for taking the intellectual contributions of women seriously. Hildegard of Bingen emerged from the archives of medieval history, and what she has to say to our era is not a message of doom. It is a message of orientation. She is not telling us that things will not be difficult. She is telling us what resources we actually have available to us when they are. She is reminding us that the viriditas cannot be permanently destroyed. It can be obscured. It can be depleted. It can be suppressed for long stretches of human history. But it is the fundamental energy of life itself, and life, as she understood with the clarity that only a long and meditative existence can produce, is always finding its way back. The green is always returning. The only question, as Hildegard of Bingen has been asking across 900 years of silence and stone walls and preserved manuscripts and renewed scholarly attention, is whether we are paying enough attention to notice. And now, having traveled to the full arc of her extraordinary life and work, I want to hear from you the ideas in Hildegard's philosophy, the concept of viriditas, the symbolic history of the 5 eras, the image of the feather on the breath of God. Which of these resonates most strongly with you? Which feels most relevant to the way you see your own time? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This is exactly the kind of conversation that the study of figures like Hildegard makes possible, a conversation across centuries about what it means to live well within the difficult passages of human history. And that conversation is far richer when you are part of it.